Hi, this is Konstantin from Fastgen, and today I want to show you how you can build a full-stack web application using WeWeb in the frontend and Fastgen in the backend. So let me show you what we'll build together. This is BuildBazaar. BuildBazaar is a fictional product discovery platform where users can submit cool tools that they want to share with others, and they can then upvote the products so that there's a bit of a ranking here. I think this is a cool showcase, as this could be anything. This could be a feature request page, even a job board or something of the likes. But let's explore what we can do in here. So first off, to submit or upvote a product, we need to sign up. So let us quickly do that. So once we're signed in, we can start submitting our own product. So I'll be submitting my cool new social app that I've built, which obviously does not exist. And let's select a thumbnail as well here. So I did not build user image upload in here, but that would be one way to do it instead of just submitting the link. One other option that I've added here is the option for the submitter to get a daily email digest how well their product is doing. If we had further functionality like comments and stuff like that, we could also include that in here. But to keep it simple, we'll just email the daily amount of upvotes to the user. Okay, looks good. So now submit it. And let's see. Yep, here it is already. We can now upvote products, and that is it. Okay, so before we start building, it's always a good idea to list our requirements so that we know exactly what we need to build without having to go back and forth. Obviously, we need a front end and a backend. In this tutorial, I will be focusing heavily on the backend. There are plenty of great tutorials out there from WeWeb if you want to build with them, or other front-end builders on how to build your front-end. But let's see, what do we need? So we definitely have some kind of sign-up functionality. So we need user auth. Then we have plenty of data we need to store. So let's think about what kind of tables we need to set up in Fastgen. First off, I think one of the most obvious ones is some kind of table to store the product data in. Probably needs some kind of ID, the name of our product, the URL. We have a description. We need to store our upvotes and the URL for the thumbnail we want to display. I think that should be it for the products. So what else? As we want the user to only be able to upvote once and also track each upvote, let's create a separate table for that. And in here, we need the ID of the user so that we can correctly attribute each upvote and then the product that the user upvoted. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, we have some kind of email functionality in there so that users can get a daily digest of the upvotes for the products that they've submitted. So let's create a third table, email digest, where we store the submitter ID. The email would be helpful. And last but not least, the product ID. So the product that they have upvoted so that we can query the upvotes for that product and then send them an email. So I think that's looking good. What else do we need? We need APIs to communicate with the front end. So what do we have here? First, we probably need some kind of API to return all the products to the front end so it can be displayed in a list. So let's call that API get all products. Then we need some API to insert products into our database. Let's call that one create products. We need one API for registering the upvotes if the user presses the upvote button. And then we need some kind of functionality for the email digest to send on a daily basis. Here, I think it's smarter to use a workflow, more specifically a cron workflow, as we said, daily, so we can run it once a day. And we'll call that one send email digest. All right. I don't think I forgot anything. So yeah, now we know what we need to build. So let's head into Fastgen, start setting up everything, and then go from there. So now that we're in our freshly created Fastgen project, let's start tackling the items from our list. First up is user auth. So we have recently released a video covering specifically how to set up user authentication in Fastgen with our user management feature, and then connect it to WeWeb and set up the connection between Fastgen and WeWeb when it comes to user auth. So if you need help with that, I would recommend you to pause this video now, head over to the other tutorial, and once you're done, come back to this tutorial here. So let's start by setting up our tables. When creating our requirements list, we identified 3 tables that we need to create. The first one is the products table, which stores all the information about the submitted products. Our first value that we need to create is an ID, some kind of unique identifier which is specific to each product that gets submitted. The neat thing about Fastgen and Postgres is that we create some system fields for each record. And one of these is the system ID. The system ID is an auto-incrementing value that starts at 1 and then increments by 1 for each new record added. So this suffices perfectly for what we need here, so no need to add an extra key here. Next up is the product name. So let's add that. Text is fine as a data type. We don't need indexing. I will not be doing any input validation for our tables here. Obviously, you can add that if you want to. Let's also set it to required and then move on to the next one, which is our product link or product URL. Let's change it to the correct data type, set it to required as well. Then we have our description. Text is fine, should be required. And the next one is upvote count, to keep track of how many upvotes each product has. This should be a number. Let's also make it required. And last but not least, the URL to a thumbnail if the user submits one. I've decided users can also submit products without an image, so let's not make this one required. And I think we're looking good here, so let's create the table. Next up is our upvotes table. This table will store 2 values, our user ID and the product ID. So the user ID is the user ID of the user that upvoted a product, and then the product ID is the ID of the product that the user upvoted. So we can correctly attribute the upvotes and also prevent users from upvoting twice for the same product. So let's see, we need our user ID. Let's make that required. And we need our product ID. I'm not sure why I changed that to a number. No, it actually should be a number. Because as we said before, our auto-incrementing system ID field is a number. So that's correct. Let's make that required as well. And looks good, so create the table. last but not least, and I guess from all of what we're building, this is the most optional feature. So feel free to just leave the whole email digest functionality out. But I think it's a cool way to understand how workflows work and our third-party integration. So I'll create that table as well. The email digest table will hold the following information. So first, the submitter ID from the person that submitted the product and the same person that we will send the digest to. Let's make it required. Then we have our submitter email, which is the email of the person that submitted, so we know who to send the email to. Let's make that required as well. And our product ID, so we know which products to query the upvotes from, and then put that in an email and send it to the user. And there should be a number as well. Technically, we could also leave out the email here and then query the email from the ID, as the user management is running over Fastgen as well. But I think it's easier to just send it from the front end here, so we have that directly. Okay, this should be looking good. So the base setup is done. We have our user authentication. We have set up our tables. Let's make that clear. Okay. So next up, I think we can start building our APIs and the workflow. So let's create our first API. As we defined in our requirements, we need some kind of endpoint that returns all the products that we have in our table to the front end, together with all accompanying information, so that the list can display those products here. This should be a fairly simple endpoint. We'll choose get, as the front end will retrieve some data from this endpoint to display. Let's give it a name. Get is fine. And as our URL path, let's say this is products and then all. Okay, let's save that. Next up, authentication. So technically this could be a public route, but I feel it's safer if we just add authentication to it. So we'll do that using an API token. We will then store the API token in WeWeb as an environment variable or as a secret, and then use that token when requesting data from this endpoint. To set up the token, let's quickly head into our project settings, API tokens, create token, and let's call it build bazaar. We don't need an expiration date. Let's create the token. And now that the token has been copied to my clipboard. So in the meantime, I'll just paste it here and make note of this. Please make sure to not store it anywhere unsafe, like in notes. Use a password manager, or even better, just put it directly into the secret or the tool where you will be needing that token. Once we're back here, we can now select our token as the required authentication option. Okay. Then this should be fairly simple. All we need to do is query the data that we have in our products table. But first, actually, let's add some mock data here so that we have something to query. I'll just promote our own product here. And here we go. I'll not add a thumbnail for now. We can do that later. Because we want to query data from our database to return with the endpoint, let us drag and drop our database query action in here. and we'll just call it retrieve all products. Let's configure a query. This is a very simple SQL statement. So we just say we want to get everything, all records from our products table. We can test that it works. Very simple, should work. And we see, okay, we return everything in here. Obviously, we just added one record, but if we had added more, they would show up here as well. All right. And really, that should already be it. We can add a simple success here. You can also customize the return if you want to, but I'll just keep it simple and send a status code 200 back. All right. If you want to, you can test it in debug mode. Let's test it. And we see, okay, we have some kind of issue here. So let's add our token. And now it works. Great. On to the next one. So before we move on to our next endpoint, let's head over to WeWeb to fetch all of the products from our get all products endpoint that we've just built in Fastgen. I've removed all API connections that I had in here previously. So let's go ahead and set that up. To load data into WeWeb, we can use multiple data sources, but obviously, as we want to connect to our API, let's add a data collection. Let's name it all products. Don't need a folder, but as a source, we select REST API. For the mode, we do dynamic. And then it's time to let Fastgen the URL of our endpoint know. Okay. Remember, we set up our route to be a protected route, so it's not public. So in order to access it, we need to make use of our API key that we created earlier. To do that, add a header, give it the key name authorization, and then add the token that you've copied and stored somewhere safer than in your notepad earlier. Copy that in there. Okay. Next, to avoid any cross-origin issues, let's proxy the request and let's see what we get. So we don't actually get anything. Let's see why that is. Okay, so apparently I forgot to add a return to our success action. Only data that you return here will be sent back to the client. Everything else just stays within your system. So let's fix that. Create a key. I'll just call mine products. And then we want to select the output from our SQL action that we've configured earlier. It's quite handy that I can just use the variable selector, use the output from our retrieve all products action, and put this placeholder in quotation marks. That looks better. Let's save it, deploy, and let's try again. Okay, and we get one item back, the one item we added into our table manually earlier. We want to preserve this data on navigation so that it doesn't have to be reloaded every time, and we want to fetch it automatically. We don't think we need to do any sorting, filtering, or any pagination right now. But one more thing we want to add is the results key. So we called ours products. So products. And perfect. Now we have direct access to the first array item that our endpoint returns. Great. So now that we have our data source connected, let's connect it to the actual elements in the front end. So within WeWeb, you can connect certain elements to data. So the first thing we want to do, we have a container here. We want this container to display all the items that are returned in our array as one set of elements. So let's go to items, edit formula, and go to our collection that we just added, all products right here. If we click the dropdown, let's go to data, result, and already we can see something's happening. So apparently I left one item connected already, which is the title, but let's do it for the others. So what do we have? We have our description, for example. So let's go in here, edit formula. And now you can see you don't need to go to our collection anymore because we added that as our primary data source. Just go to item. In this case, we want to link the key product description to our description element. So let's select that. And we can see already pops up. So what else do we have? We have our button. And as a button text, we want to display the upvote count. So same thing here, press text, edit formula. Let's see, upvote count, here we go. Great. What else? We have our hyperlink to link to the products page. So for that, select the element. The link attribute is under this settings section up here. And we want the target of the link to be the URL that was returned by our endpoint. So product link. Also, it's very helpful that WeWeb always displays the variable for the result variable for whatever you have selected in the formula builder up here. Okay, that looks good as well. Let's change the image. So remember when we first added a record to the table, we did not choose a thumbnail, so it's null. It will not display anything. But still, we want to link it for the other products that might be added that contain a thumbnail. And already, I think this is starting to look pretty good. But to make sure it really works, let's add a second product to our products table. And if we did everything right, it should show up right beneath. So let me just grab the mock product name and description that I used earlier. This way we can also check whether the image linking is working. Okay, table has been updated. So if you refresh this page now, it should automatically refetch the data for the collection. So call our endpoint, which should return 2 products now. Let's see whether that's the case. And perfect, here we go. So first step done. Let's work on the next step, which is our Upvote API. So let's create our Upvote endpoint. So click Add Route. We could either choose a create or post route or an update or patch route. Let's go with update or patch as we want to modify an already existing resource, being the record of the product, because we want to increment the upvote count there. So let's call this endpoint upvote product. Let's give it a path. again, we definitely want to authenticate this route. And then let's think about what we want to do. So again, we want to increment the upvote value. Let me show you. So we want to increment this by 1, but we also want to create a second entry in the upvotes table where we track which user has upvoted which product in order to make sure that they don't vote twice. So let's start with our first database query. And let's call this one register user upvote. Okay. Now, what we want to do is we want to insert into our table that we called upvotes, I think. Let's make sure. Yep, it's called upvotes. 2 values. So number 1 is our user ID. And number 2 is our product ID. And the values that should be inserted into those keys, we will get from the body of our HTTP request that we will send to Fastgen from WeWeb. So let's access our request body by using our variable picker. Let's just choose body. And we will send the user ID from WeWeb. So let's stick with the naming user ID. Our second data point, our product ID, will also come from the request body. Now, as we said earlier, we did not define a separate variable for the product ID in our table. We just use our system ID. So let's stick with that. And that should already be it. Let's test the query. Okay, we have a syntax error. Oh, that's because I wrote value and it should be values. Perfect. Let's save it. Second step, we want to increment the upvotes value in our products table. So let's grab another DB query. Let's call this one increment product upvotes. And let's configure the query. So instead of writing this SQL query by hand, I want to show you a nifty feature we have that will make your life a lot easier. It's called the SQL Copilot. So here you can describe in natural language what you want to achieve. And then we can see if the AI can help you with that. So in our case, let's say we want to write a SQL statement that increments the value of upvote count of a record that matches a certain system ID in the products table. So let's see. That looks pretty good. So the only thing that's left for us to do is to replace that certain system ID with the actual system ID. So let's choose our body variable placeholder again and say body system ID. Let's test it. Looks good. And last but not least, let's add a return. So here we really don't need any output of data. We could return that it has been successful, but for the sake of simplicity, I'll just return a simple 200 status code here. let's deploy this. And this one we can actually just test in Fastgen right away before trying to implement. To test it, we need to pass the 2 input values that we need. Again, those are our user ID and system ID. So let's head into debug mode and mock our body content. So we have our system ID. Remember, it started at 1 and will increment for each product. So let's upvote the second product that we added. And then we had our user ID. As we are not validating the user ID in this case, we can just test it with something random. And what failed? Authentication. So let's add that. Try it again. This looks much better. Okay, so we don't get any errors back. Let's head over to the database to check whether our upvote has been registered. Wonderful. And last but not least, has our value been incremented? It has. Cool, so second endpoint done. Before we move on to our third and final endpoint, let's implement our Upvote products endpoint in WeWeb. So let us select the element that the user clicks when pressing the Upvote button, which in this case is my div here. Then head over to this section right here, press the lightning bolt, which is where we can configure workflows. Press on the workflow. Per default, it already says on click. So whatever else follows here will happen after the user clicks on that button. So let's configure our request. Select REST API request. Let's give it a name. Remember, we configured our endpoint to be an update or a patch endpoint. And now let's copy the URL over. So as we just tested it in debug mode, you know that we need 2 values that we need to pass to our endpoint. Let's configure those with a formula, as we want to pull the values that we want to send from our front-end elements. So we want our system ID. And our system ID we can find under the item, which is one item from our collection that we pulled earlier. We already have it, system ID. And then we want the user ID. We'll find that in the user section here, user, and this is the Fastgen user UUID. Again, if you need help setting that up, go to the tutorial that we've linked below, and that will show you how you get the user auth set up. Okay, we can see in our preview already, this looks great. Our system ID of the first product is 1, and the user ID we just selected. So this is what our endpoint expects. Next, we need to add our authorization header. Same thing, bearer and the token that you've created on Fastgen. Again, let's proxy it to avoid any cross-origin issues. And this should look good. So let's have a look what our endpoint, our create product endpoint, will receive from the front end. I have prepared this little modal that opens after a user clicks submit product. And this modal contains 4 input boxes and 1 checkbox. So we have our product name, our URL, thumbnail, a description, And then optional, a checkbox where the user can opt in to receive a daily email digest of how well their product is doing on Build Bazaar. With that knowledge, let's head over to Fastgen and set up our final API route. Here, I'll select Post or Create because we want to create a new resource that is adding a record to our products table. Let's give this a name. And a path. We definitely want to protect this route, so let's select the token that we created earlier. And let's create our first SQL query. All right, I'm gonna save us the typing because it will be essentially exactly the same what we did before with two small exceptions. So we want to insert into our products table the value submitter ID, product name, product link, product description, thumbnail, and upvote count. We'll pull all that information from the body. Now the two exceptions are, first, the upvote count, we don't want to pull that from the request coming from the front end, but rather we want to just set it to 0 as every newly added product should start at 0 upvotes. Then the second thing is, for the email digest, I want to return the system ID. Now, the thing is, we cannot know the system ID before having actually executed this insert into product statement here. Because as you remember, the system ID will only be assigned when the product gets added. So it's an incremental value, whatever its place is in the table, it will be +1 the previous system ID. So by putting the statement returning system ID, this action will output the system ID of this product that we add here. So let's test our query. Looks good. And then let's save it. So what else do we need to do? So we have added our product yet, but what about our email digest? Let's check whether the user wants to receive it. To do that, we add an if condition. Let's say check if email opt-in is true. We will send that data from WeWeb to Fastgen. So again, we'll grab it from the body of our request and we'll call that email digest. So here we use a comparison operator and check whether the value or the Boolean being sent is equal to true. So if the user wants to receive emails. If it's not true, then we're done here. But if it is true, we want to add the user and the email of the user and the product for which the user wants to receive the digest to our database, more specifically to our table called email digest. So let's get that done. Again, copying it in to save us the typing. Insert into email digest. We want the submitter ID, which we're getting from the body. We want our product ID. Now remember, we just returned that from our previous SQL statement. So let's test it. Okay, looks good. One note, I have renamed the database query in the meantime. So make sure that you will choose the correct action name here. Okay, let's give it a name. Insert into email digest. And that should be it for our third and final endpoint. So now all that's left is to configure our workflow for the email digest. But before we do that, let me show you how we can connect this API to WeWeb. So back in WeWeb, let's choose our form container to set up the workflow. So the form container is, as the name suggests, the element that contains your input elements. And once the user submits it, we can configure a workflow of what will happen once the user submits it. So let's go into it. I've pre-configured our request. So we want to pass all of the variables that we need in our flow. So the submitter ID, the product name, the product link, description, and so on. And as we did before, when we configured the Upvote endpoint, we will choose the values or the variables from our input elements in here in the formula builder, so we can pass that values properly. I've added a close modal action afterwards so that the state of the modal changes and it closes. So all that's left to do here is let's grab our URL, put it in here, again add our authorization header. So let me redo that. Bearer, here we go. Okay. And that should be it. So let's move on to our final topic that we cover, which is the workflow. To create our send email digest workflow, let's choose a time-based workflow, otherwise known as Cron-based workflow. So we'll call that one send email digest. We'll leave it as active. And as it's a daily digest, we want to send it once a day. So select the time at which you want to send out the email and hit save. So now every day at midnight in the Central European time zone, this workflow will trigger and execute whatever follows after our top action block. So if you remember, we have our email digest table where we store the submitter email, the product ID, and the submitter ID. So we want to know who wants to receive the digest. So let's write our query in here. Pretty simple one. We're gonna select all the records from our email digest table. Let's test it. Okay. And this action will return our data as an array. So next, we want to loop through all the entries. So we'll select loop data. So let's just leave that as loop. That's not great naming, but we'll do for this tutorial. And we want to get the data that our SQL query returns. So in the variable selector here, we will choose data from previous action, namely from our recipient's action, as we want to loop through them. Okay. So next, we want to actually send the email. But before we send the email, let's think about what we want to write in there. So let's say we want to send the user a daily update on where their upvotes stand. If we remember, in our email digest table, we don't have that information. So we need to get that from somewhere. We have that information in our products table. So let's create another query so we can get the data from there. Let's call that get upvotes. What we want to do here is we want to select the upvote count from our products table. And to tell SQL which record to get the upvote count from in our products table, we need to provide it with the value that it should look for. So in our case, we want the product ID, or as we called it previously, system ID. Let's select the current item that we're looping through. And add product ID. Okay, looks good. And all that's left now is to send the actual email. So choose your favorite email provider. You can either use our native integration if you directly want to connect to an SMTP email server, or use any of our third-party email provider integrations, or even use the HTTP request to make use of a provider that we have not integrated with yet. I'm going to choose resend. And the first thing you will have to do is to connect to your account. In the case of resend, this is done via an API key. So let me quickly connect that, and then we'll continue setting this up. So now that I've connected my resend account with my API key, let's set up the resend action. First, let's fill out the recipient, so to whom this email should go. Remember, we had that data stored in our email digest table under submitter email, and we returned the data with our database query up here. So let's fetch that data for the current item that we are looping over. Submitter email. Let's just say we'll send it from digest at, and then configure our email. Okay. As a message body, you can put literally whatever you want. Your product has, and let's say action get upvotes. You can make this much fancier than I did, but I think as an example it will suffice. And here we go. So we've reached the end of the tutorial. This is how you build a simple full-stack web app with WeWeb and Fastgen. I hope you learned something or found it helpful otherwise. If there are any topics you would want us to dive deeper into or understand better that we haven't covered yet, let us know. If there are any questions, feel free to head over to our community Slack so our team or our community can help you out there. And with that, see you next time.